Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1991 Gothic fantasy Edward Scissorhands. Now, this is one of those films that when I first saw it when I was young, I thought this was a genuinely great movie. I thought it was unlike anything that I had seen before, which is why I used to watch it quite a bit. But over the years, it's definitely lost a bit of its luster. It's definitely a film that, to me personally, is not as sharp as it honestly could be. No pun intended. And before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on the film, I would like to give a special shout out to Sean for requesting another review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. A link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, Edward Scissorhands is directed by Tim Burton, and I think he did a terrific job with this. Like, his direction in this is tremendous. It's everything that you are looking for out of a Burton film, and then some when it comes to the way that he's handling the camera. There is just a lot of splendid, sublime camera work in this when it comes to the pans or the zooms or the wide shots or the different angles that he's utilizing, the way that he showcases Bo Welch's gorgeous Gothic production design is definitely a sight to behold. And there's certain scenes in this movie that really do leave a significant impression, like the ice dance sequence, which is incredible. It's incredible in a multitude of different ways. It's really well set up when it comes to the framing of the scene, um, and how well Burton matches the overall emotion and the atmosphere and the vibe of that sequence with his camera work. The camera is actually twirling in sync with Winona Ryder when she's spinning around while Edward is making the ice sculpture. And there's a lot of moments like that throughout the movie where Tim really does showcase some really great skills as a director. Now, the screenplay is honestly where the majority of the film's faults lie. I mentioned this in the beginning of the review, talked about how it's not as sharp as it could be, and this is why that's the case. And I think that's for a multitude of reasons. For one, I think Caroline Thompson was not necessarily the wrong person for the script, but she wasn't experienced enough to handle everything. So I think that she really should have had an extra writing partner on this. Tim should have brought somebody that he had worked with previously, like Michael McDowell, who helped write Beetlejuice, or some of the other co-writers that he's worked with in the past with some of the previous films that he did. Maybe some of the co-writers like Sam Hamm, some of the people that worked on Batman, to kind of be there to help Caroline, because Caroline had never written a script before she wrote the screenplay for Edward Scissorhands. And you can honestly tell. That's why there isn't as much depth when it comes to some of the characters. That's why there's a lot of lazy decisions that are made when it comes to the writing. And that's why the third act in particular falls as flat as it ultimately does. But she was clearly a talented enough writer due to how strong the first and second acts are, that she was definitely somebody who should have been involved a lot with the script. I just feel that she needed somebody else there to help her along. But Tim just threw her into the deep end. He was just like, "Hey, I like a book that you wrote. I want you to write my movie." And like, I don't blame Caroline for taking the job. I mean, who wouldn't? Tim Burton at this point was like one of the hottest directors in the industry. You write a film for Tim Burton and it winds up being a hit, well, now your foot is firmly in the door and you will be able to get a lot of other opportunities in the future to write other films. So I don't blame her at all. I just think that she really did need somebody else. And Tim didn't really give her that. Just made it a sink or swim opportunity for Caroline. And I think it honestly, at points, was to the detriment of the film. But like I said, the first and second acts of this script are really strong. I even like the way that it's framed. It's framed with a wraparound segment of sorts that involves a grandmother telling the story of Edward Scissorhands to her granddaughter. I think that's a nice way to open up the film and to also bookend it. The fact that it's an older Kim that's telling this story makes it all the more resonant. And I think the way that things initially start out with a bit of like a backstory of Edward, and then the way that the script sprinkles in and throws in uh, these. These bits with Edward and his father, the inventor, are really well handled in terms of the way that these particular moments are placed throughout the screenplay. And I do like that more unorthodox approach when it comes to like the creation of Edward and the scenes with the inventor. They don't just have that all in the beginning because I think that really would have affected the pacing. And I think the film already kind of suffers from some pacing problems. So if you had everything all in the beginning, then and then you get to the stuff with Peg and the neighborhood and all the neighbors and the reactions to Edward, I think that would be a bit too tedious. So I'm glad that they handle things differently, or the writer in this case, Caroline Thompson, handled things differently. But yeah, I like the first and second acts. I like the the scenes with Peg and her family, and I like how the neighborhood itself is some really surreal take on suburbia, with every house painted in a pastel color and everybody acting like they're straight out of Better Homes and Gardens. Like I definitely really like that approach to the film. It's a very bizarre, weird concept. So you really need to put Edward in a world that actually makes it feel like he fits in it. And I definitely feel that the screenplay does a good job doing that. The scenes when Peg befriends Edward and sees him for the first time and then takes him home with her are very charming and definitely have a lot of heart to them. I really like the dynamic and the overall connection between Edward and Peg, and eventually Edward and Kim, Peg's daughter. And just a lot of the fish out of water stuff I really enjoy. I really enjoy Edward trying to fit in the neighborhood. Even Edward just trying to do basic things like eat dinner at the dinner table with Scissorhands, or the stuff with the water bed, and a lot of that stuff. I really enjoy that. I think it's a lot of fun. And then when Edward uses his skills to further ingratiate himself into the neighborhood, it's also a lot of uh, fun to watch. The stuff involving his crazy skills when it comes to garden art and dog grooming and hairstyling. But I have to be honest, the hairstyling wasn't as impressive as the garden art or the dog grooming, because those hairstyles were butt ugly. I'm going to be honest here. They were not attractive. But that might have been the point. Maybe that might have been the gag there, that, oh, he does hairstyles for the women, but it's the same as their dogs. But it just didn't really click for me as something that was really that funny. And that's something that happens a lot in this script. That's why having a different writer might have helped a little bit in terms of punching up the comedic bits. Because there's a lot of stuff that's it's tongue in cheek, but it's not funny. It's just weird. It's just weird, but not in a way that is really that humorous. And I think with a better writer, you could really work with the dark comedy aspects. You could really make it into a funnier film. I think having the writer, for instance, of Heathers would have been brilliant. That would have been really good to have that kind of comedy in this. But you don't really get that. And there's the satire isn't really that well done either. It's very surface level. It's not really that inspired beyond the pastel coloring of the houses and the way that people in the suburbs act. Uh, Other than that, like, it's not really that well done. And another aspect of the script that I think really doesn't work that well is how Caroline handles the antagonists. Edward is a great protagonist. The script does a good job making you sympathize with him and feel for him and root for him. You want him to even be able to get a loan successfully so he can create his own business. Like, you really want him to succeed, and you really like the relationship that he's built with Peg and the rest of Peg's family. But when you get to Jim, who is Kim's boyfriend, and him not liking Edward, there's no depth to that character. There's zero depth to that guy. He comes across as a very weak antagonist as a result. And on top of that, the reason why he's not trusting Edward seems to be justified. Because from his perspective, he just sees his girlfriend get cut by Edward. He doesn't see everything that happened before that. He just sees his girlfriend cut and bleeding. He sees the same thing happening to Kim's brother. Yeah, he almost drunkenly hit him with his van, but he doesn't see the kid. He didn't see the kid until he sees the kid on the side of the road with Edward doing this, and the kid's getting all cut up. And I think Edward was trying to calm him down, but I don't know why Edward was doing this. Like, that was not very good writing. Why was Edward doing this? Like, why couldn't he just be like, hands up, or get up, stand up, and while the kid is freaking out, instead of continuing to claw at him? Like, it just, that didn't make Edward look good, and it seemed out of character for Edward. So did the way that Edward ultimately takes out Jim in the climax. The writer didn't do the best job in terms of making it seem like Jim was actually doing things in a way that warranted him getting stabbed to death. Yeah, he was aggressive. Yeah, he was beating up on Edward. Yeah, he flung Kim aside, but there wasn't a point where, like, he really hurt Kim. There wasn't a point where it seemed like he was going to actually kill Edward. He was just beating up on him, but it didn't really seem like he had anything that was actually going to kill him. And so Edward doing what he did in self-defense just doesn't really have the impact I think that it honestly should have. It just makes Edward look bad. And there's a lot of that stuff that happens in this script that just don't make Edward look the way that he did previously. It's almost like the writer did a 180 in terms of how to write this character. And the way that Jim is written, Like I said, there's no depth to him. You don't know why he acts the way that he does, beyond the fact that he thinks that Edward is dangerous. And he is. He's got scissors for hands and he cut people. So he's not really wrong. And there's not really a point where the neighborhood ever sees Jim the same way that other people do. They see him and his flaws. They just see him for being this kind of heroic figure. So that's not good writing. Where the only reason why you're able to see Jim as a character that has these flaws is from the perspective of the audience watching the movie, but not anybody else other than maybe Kim. And I think because of the fact that Jim is such a paper thin character and villain, Caroline overcompensates for that by making the neighborhood itself more villainous. And it becomes ridiculous because they turn on a dime so quickly that it's just something that becomes laughable and not in a good way. Like, okay, this neighborhood and all these women, they were loving Edward, they were feeding him all the food and loving his haircuts and loving his garden art and wanting him to do all these things and thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then he gets busted once for attempted robbery, and there are a few other things that happen, and they automatically start believing the crazy religious nut Esmeralda, who's talking about him being the devil's child or the spawn of Satan himself. And there's not barely any pushback. There's barely any moments where the other people in the neighborhood are like, hey, we have had kids that have made mistakes. Why are we turning on Edward like this? He's been living up in a house on the mountain on the hill for so long and never really had any contact with anybody. Like, cut him some slack. He's learning. And other than maybe one scene, there really isn't a lot of that. So the neighborhood just becomes cartoonishly villainous. So they're not effective as antagonists, and neither is Jim. And the cartoonishly villainous neighborhood is a big part of why the third act falls so flat. Edward seems to be acting out of character. You have some great moments in the third act, like the ice dancing scene, but that's one scene. It doesn't make up for all the other scenes that aren't anywhere near as strong as the previous scenes before it. And like I said, the finale with the fight with Edward and Jim getting stabbed, the way that it looks like Jim just walked into Edward's Scissorhands and then fell out the window. It doesn't look like Edward took him out in self-defense. And if he did, it's not set up that well and doesn't look good because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Because Jim doesn't really look like he's doing enough to warrant Edward having to kill him. And the messaging of this script and this story is way off. At first, you're thinking it's a story, it's a tale of accepting the abnormal, taking people who are different and accepting them for who they are into society. And it's a good message. But then in the third act, it undoes all of that. And now it's like, oh no, if you're different and you're abnormal, uh, you should not be a part of society because you're going to hurt people, and it's not right for you to be a part of society. You should be separate from it because you're a danger to society. And I'm like, wait, what kind of confused ass morals is that? Like, the morals in this script are maddening, really. It's like, oh hey, it's okay to be different even if you have scissors for hands and you're a weirdo. you can still have a place in society. Oh, psych! Nope, sorry, you can't. You're still always going to be a danger to society. So you need to isolate yourself from everybody else. Go back up to that house on the hill and lock yourself away, never to see uh, anyone in society ever again. It's like, what? Yeah, the third act is not good, and the messaging of the script and the story is pretty poor, but there are still moments of magic here. There really are. Like, there's still scenes like the ice dancing sequence. There's still the fun fish out of water stuff with Edward when he's first being introduced to society and trying to adapt to suburbia. And there's still a lot of fun to be had in those moments and those sequences, and there's still some strong characterization, but there's also a lot of weak characterization, and there's a lot of tonal issues, and the comedy isn't really the best throughout. And then you have the ending and the third act, which is just not very sharp and is uh honestly about as effective as trying to cut through something with a dull blade. It's just, I wouldn't say disappointing, but it's definitely a film that doesn't live up to its full potential because of these issues that the screenplay has. I think you have a smattering of concepts and ideas here, but it's not completely cohesive and functional. I think a great way to describe the script overall by Caroline Thompson is that it's like one of the inventor's failed prototypes for Edward. On the surface, it looks like it's functional and it can move around and it can be somewhat efficient. But when you look closer, there's some gears that are in the wrong place, and there's some parts of it that aren't even working at all. And it's understandable that it's a prototype and it's not a finished product. And I think that's really due to the fact that all Caroline had to work with was some drawings that Tim wrote when he was a kid. I mean, drawings that he drew when he was a kid. My bad. And some other sort of ideas from his head, and nothing else other than that. And for a first time writer, that's incredibly difficult. And it's incredibly difficult for any writer. And so she did the best that she could, but I do feel that it's mixed when it comes to the results. Now, the cast, I think for the most part, except for one particular character, is great. Johnny Depp as Edward Scissorhands, he's excellent. This is honestly still to this day some of his best work as an actor because so much of this role requires him to emote without saying anything. It honestly is asking a lot out of an actor in order to pull it off. He has to do things in a way when it comes to his movements and the way that he shows emotion with just his face or a look or a glance or just the movement of his body without overdoing it, without making it into something that's just absurd histrionics. And he has to find a way to make this character still somebody that the audience can connect with despite his appearance, despite how different he is. And he does that. And I can't think of another actor who would have done anywhere near as good of a job. Definitely not Tom Cruise, because this is a true story. The studio, for whatever reason, they were really thinking that Tom Cruise as Edward Scissorhands was a great idea. And it got to the point where they had Tim Burton meet up with Tom to discuss Edward Scissorhands. And Tom is like asking all these questions to Tim, like, what is, how does Edward do certain things? Like, how does Edward go to the bathroom? How does Edward do all this stuff? And Tim was like, I don't know. I don't know, Tom. It's a fairy tale. Like what he just it just works out. And because of that meeting, Tim understandably was like, I don't think Tom Cruise is the right fit. And the studio had to eventually drop that stupid idea. And the role ultimately went to Johnny Depp. Now, I know another person that was considered for it. I think it was Gary Oldman. And he wound up turning it down. But Johnny Depp ultimately got the role, and yeah, it was just a great fit. Like he even studied Charlie Chaplin for his performance in this. So it really shows you that he knew what was necessary to make this character work and become endearing to the audience. Now, Winona Ryder is Kim Boggs. I think when it's her just being the teenage girl who becomes ultimately in love with Edward, her performance is pretty good. But when she's elderly Kim in old age makeup, it's pretty awful because she's just trying to act old and it's not believable at all. Um, but I did like the scenes with her when she was a teenager and the scenes with her and Johnny Depp. I think at this time they were already dating, I think, and you could definitely sense and feel that chemistry when it comes to their scenes together. Um, but Dianne Wiest, like she was arguably other than Johnny Depp, like she was the other performer in this that shined the most. Like she was just uh really great in her role as Peg. Just a lot of things about that character were just so endearing and lovable, and you just really liked her. Just seemed like a really nice, well-natured person, and it really did kind of break your heart when she wasn't able to kind of to convince the neighborhood to give Edward another chance because of everything that ultimately happened. And a lot of that has to do with how well Diane played that character. I still to this day think it's one of her best performances. Of course, you have Vincent Price as the inventor and what wound up being his last on screen film role. And man, he is clearly ill, but he still has that charm. He still has that uniqueness that makes Vincent Price such a memorable performer. And it's a true testament to his skill and his ability as an actor and a performer to still, give it his all and provide a performance that still leaves a distinct impact and impression, despite him clearly being worse for wear. And yeah, it's really nice and honestly fitting that Tim was able to get the opportunity to work with Vincent because he admired Vincent. Vincent Price is one of his favorite actors, one of his favorite people in general. His short film Vincent is a tribute to Vincent Price. And Vincent was one of the few people that actually supported Tim early on in his career. So, in a lot of ways, this is things coming full circle. And Tim allowing Vincent to be in this movie and to have that role as the inventor, the man who creates Edward, and give him one last swan song, so to speak, uh, for his career. Alan Arkin, he doesn't really have the meatiest role to work with, but he does the best that he can, and his own sensibilities still shine through when it comes to his performance as Bill. Uh, you also got like Robert Oliveri, who plays Kevin, Kim's brother. He was the one of the brothers in Honey I Shrunk the Kids, so it was kind of cool to see him in something else. Uh, You also have Kathy Baker plays Joyce, And I'm not gonna blame the actress. It's not her fault when it comes to the awkward nature of that scene in the salon in the back room. She does the best that she can with everything that she has to work with. And I will admit, there were some moments with her character that were actually kind of humorous. You also have Olan Jones as Esmeralda, who I honestly didn't think delivered that great of a performance as the crazy religious, not just me personally. And you got Anthony Michael Hall as Jim. Look, I like Anthony Michael Hall as an actor. He was not the right fit for this role. It just I just don't buy it. I never bought it. It doesn't help that the character doesn't have a lot of depth. So it really relies on Anthony Michael Hall just making this character work. And he's not, at this point in his career, a nuanced or strong enough actor to pull that off. And I think that they were looking for the wrong actor the entire time because initially their first choice was Sean Astin, which I don't even understand that at all. I love Sean as an actor. I think he's talented, but he's not the right fit for playing a jerk character because it's just not in his bones. And Sean knew that and he turned it down because even he was like, I don't think I could pull this off. And there were some people that were rumored, like Christian Slater and Kiefer Sutherland. Either one of them would have been way better. And I think they would have made this character work more, even with all of the issues when it comes to how the character is written, because they're just so much better at evoking a certain feel, a certain vibe to the audience that you just never bought with Anthony Michael Hall. When he's, like, beating up on Edward, when he's being physical, you're like, I don't buy it. You're still the kid from 16 Candles and Vacation. Like, it's why I never bought him in Johnny Be Good, but that was a comedy, so I could still kinda work around that, and he was, eh, also kinda not that believable in the Tales from the Crypt episode that he was in called Creep Course, but the fact that the character was honestly kind of a wimp despite him acting all tough, that made the character and that made the performance still uh work. But here it just doesn't work to me. Like he's supposed to be this intimidating character and I didn't find him to be intimidating at all. So that's the weakest performance for me in the cast is from Anthony Michael Hall. That's why I saved him for last, so to speak, because I just wanted to give my praises and then, throw in a little bit of some criticisms. I don't have much criticisms at all for the technical aspects of the movie. Just really a nice, gorgeous looking cinematography by Stefan Seposky. And I really like the editing by Richard Halsey and Colleen Halsey. Um, and the score by Danny Elfman is excellent. In a lot of ways, that's the heartbeat of this movie, and it's such a majestic score. It's to this day one of his finest works, and Danny would agree. Like I think he's even said that this is his favorite score that he's done, and I don't think it's his best, but I could definitely see why it honestly is the best to him because it just has a lot of good emotion behind it. The ice dance score, for instance, is just absolutely spectacular, and that alone is some of his best work when it comes to compositions of notes and other things like that. And I can't believe this wasn't even nominated for a score for best score at the Oscars. Like that seems like something that's honestly rather shocking to me that it didn't even get a nomination. And of course, I also need to mention the costume design, the makeup. That's also another thing that was really great about Edward Scissorhands. But yeah, I really don't know what else to say about the film except Thanks for watching my review, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.